Hello and welcome to this session of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. So we're looking in this episode about preventing sexual harm and sexual violence. So we have a week to sort of raise awareness about this, the 7th to 13th of February. So we thought we'd talk a little bit about it. And it's one of the questions I get asked the most by people who ask me what I do. Is ask me why would I work with people that have committed sexual offences? And generally I would tell them the same as I do with any offence, I'm doing it to prevent further victims of whatever offence it is. But somehow society sees people that convicted of sexual offences very differently to other people that are convicted of other offences, which is really interesting to me. And I think that a lot of it is because I haven't really thought about the difference, and some people do just see it as the sort of ultimate of offences, really. And people who have committed those sorts of offences feel that themselves, often about themselves as well.
So much focus is always on the person who's committed the crime, that to think about prevention strategies is just somewhere that I haven't ever spent. I don't think I've spent enough time thinking about. So I think it's a really good week to raise awareness of it and to think about our responsibility as society, but also as forensic psychologists to think about how we can help and raise awareness to prevention strategies for crimes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's been a lot of discussion of how it's not the responsibility of women, for instance, to prevent attacks on themselves, but it being a very joint effort of everybody being aware of all these sorts of things. And I think you described a really good acronym about how we might think about that.
I think also, before I go into that, I did some research recently where it was looking at specifically about an experience of females, and one of the points, it was a qualitative piece, and one of the points that was raised was someone saying, it's also the responsibility of the males, and it's not just responsibility shouldn't always be given to the person to solve the problem, because I think we can run the risk of going into some sort of victim blaming type arena, really, which isn't helpful. We need to ensure that males are on board.
We know generally that the 95% of offences are perpetrated by men, but obviously we know men can be victims of sexual offences too. And so I think it is really important to keep that in mind. Statistically, you're more likely as a young woman, but it's any age that can happen to people of any age, but you're at the higher risk. And I guess, the maybe lifestyle, where people go and where the sort of positions they might be in, places they might go that might raise their risk in that way.
The acronym that I found was on a website, which we will link at the bottom of the video, and the acronym was the word STOP, and it was all to do with stop sexual violence, and the S stood for promote social norms that protect against violence, and that included ensuring that you mobilize men and boys as allies and not make it all about women being not only the solution to the problem, but also in doing that you're not suggesting that all men are the problem. The T in the STOP stood for teach skills to prevent sexual violence, and this idea stemmed from you should start so young, start in primary schools and talk about it, and make sure that as society it's not a hush topic. If we're open and we're talking about it all the time like we are now, and in having awareness weeks, and actually we're making sure that it's not a hush topic and people are open and honest about emotional learning, as they called it. Provide opportunities to empower and support girls and women, and that included strengthening leadership and opportunity for girls, strengthening economic support for women and family. The P was create protective environments, and that included improving safety and monitoring in schools, establishing workplace policies, and addressing community level risks through environmental approaches. And then SV was sexual violence, but they turned it into support victims and survivors to lessen harm. So we should have victim-centered services rather than other type of services and treatment for victims for sexual violence.
That sounds really well thought out. And I think society's views are changing. There's lots of, you often see in a pub, you might see on the back of a door, if something's happening, go and ask for Angela, or ask these different things, where you can go to the bar and just sort of quietly ask for some help in some way without drawing attention to yourself. So I think the society is changing in that way, in the places where people might feel vulnerable. But of course, we know a lot of offences will happen in the home where someone should feel safe, and I think a lot it can be about not being aware of what might be signs, for instance, of sexually offending against children, of what the signs might be to protect your children, for them to know or for you to know what how you might know that you're at risk of that. So
Mm.
people coming into your home and befriending you, for instance, as an opportunity to get with the children, and then you feeling somehow that you can be trusting people, or them finding a way of getting themselves in a position where they're on their own with the children. So
Mm.
being aware that these things happen where and very often the person say, I'm just so shocked, I thought they were such a nice person. I know they can be in some ways, but in other ways they're sort of using that aspect to gain trust and access to children.
And then, and also when you do have concerns, where do you go with that information? That needs to be
Mm.
openly signposted, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of sexual offences aren't reported. So, of course,
Mm.
the trouble is we're looking at data of those that have been convicted, which again is a tiny proportion. So we're looking at data from that, but we don't know the majority of people who've had this happen haven't reported it. And sometimes when you look at the statistics, so if you look at statistics of people have been convicted, but there's also polls where they look at ask people to write anonymously, and they might be more accurate because people feel that they haven't got to go through the whole process of going to the police and talking about something that they feel, because of the way society can look at it, is something it's their fault, it's happened to them. And again, that's something you hear so often, it's my fault, I put myself in that position. Another thing that came up about being a victim of sexual harassment at work, and I guess now this should be happening less and less, and I think as you found in your research, people talk about over half of people have had sort of catcalling at work, or 4 in 10 have been groped or faced sort of some unwelcome touching. I mean, these are high figures, really. A third of women have been followed, and 1 in 5 have faced indecent exposure. So again, these are quite high figures of people. Today we were talking about a man in prison who'd sort of pressed his alarm bell, and when the officer came, was masturbating. So she was obviously quite shocked and not expecting that. And it's not that unusual in prison, but it's still a shocking thing to happen. And it's still, if that happened out on the streets, she could easily get the person convicted for indecent exposure. So those sorts of things happen, and they don't always get counted and reported.
I think with the power of the media, definitely with, we think of some of the most infamous cases recently, there definitely seems to be an arena whereby it's okay to say it's not okay, and that's happened to me, and I'm not willing to accept it. And I think that's really empowering for women and men who have suffered sexual harassment at work or sexual violence outside of work, and also empowering for the younger generation to know the boundaries of things that it's okay to and to not experience, and to promote healthy sexual relationships.
And also that some figures, when you see that it seems like there's drop in figures of people having sexual offences against them, but in other times it seems like there's been increases. So it'd be interesting to see after COVID what sort of impact that's had, with more people being at home and not being able to leave their homes. But there were 73,000 recorded between 2019 and 2020 assaults against children in the UK. So there's a lot of people, there's a lot of children whose lives will be changed. And what we know from the work we do is that it's often the response to it that makes a big difference as to how the person recovers. So if they're supported and they're believed, and somebody does everything they can to help them afterwards, that can make such a difference. Whereas we know lots of cases where the people report it and it's not believed, or they're punished for reporting it. So those are the things that it is really important to give the support and help the person, and help them to process it, talk about it and deal with it. But that can be very difficult if you're the parent of a child, to hear that sort of information being given to you. It's really difficult to listen to.
And with the I think about when, in that analogy, that company was talking about how your services should be victim informed, but again, like we were talking about in the episode with missing people, it's really important that if you're going to involve the victim in developing a service or an assessment of some sorts, you need to make sure that they're ready to talk about it, and ensuring that there's the right support for them in doing so.
And the sort of statistics say that girls are more likely to be victims of sexual offences. But in my experience, there's lots of boys who probably haven't reported it where it's happened to them, they just haven't reported it. So again, it's not clear how accurate that is. And thinking about how many, children, how much, what the impact might be on them long term, where if they can't even sort of acknowledge to themselves that they've actually been a victim in that way.
Yeah, because society might have this culture whereby you have to uphold your masculinity and you can't say that you've been sexually abused or something's happened to you.
Yeah, and it's very hard for anybody to talk about, and so it's difficult for people to understand and to sort of hear. So people don't want to talk about it because they know it's difficult to hear. We just published a piece of research that's in press at the moment about people who've been both a victim and a perpetrator of sexual offending, and how difficult that can be, that they're both so shameful. So how you talk about either of those or both of those cases, it's quite difficult to be able to come out and talk about that and try and process it, make sense of why you did what you did.
Yeah, that was powerful.
And then people, as we said, the society's views about it. So how easy it is for people to come out, and how people respond when you sort of do talk about it can be make a difference as to whether you talk about it again, really, even if it's to your friends or someone who want to support you, really.
Yeah, that's so key, isn't it? I think how times have changed as I've got older, that it feels more acceptable to talk about it. But before, maybe 10, 15 years ago, perhaps it wasn't as accepted to talk about it, or maybe accepted isn't the right word, but maybe there wasn't enough support or not enough information. Maybe we weren't knowledgeable enough or ready to share it. Ready to share the support, I'm not sure, but it does feel like times are changing, which is great, but also rather it just not be happening.
Yeah.
But it's really fantastic that there is, that it does feel like times are changing and we can talk about it. And the power of social media, I feel like I always say this, there's so much negativity around social media, but I mean, with this Preventing Sexual Violence Week, there's a hashtag you can use of "It's Not Okay," and the idea is that people are promoting Preventing Sexual Violence Week and using that hashtag. And I think just the very nature of that hashtag and what it stands for, and just the saying "it's not okay," it's a really good initiative.
So I think generally very often we develop that we don't say no to people. So actually when you do have to say something, and so a lot of people in a shock state won't say no, they won't say anything because they're in shock. So that's taken to be consent when actually obviously isn't. So I think it is it's okay, but I think it's the hashtag about it's okay to talk about it as well. It's really helpful to see it in that way. So we hope to raise awareness, and as always, if you've got anything you'd like us to talk about, then by all means, drop us a line, drop us an email, tweet us, and we'll look forward to talking to you. And it just remains for us to say, let's talk forensic psychology.